In the spring of 1823, Elias Harrison guided his ox-drawn wagon along the muddy ruts of what would become the Cumberland Road, his wife Martha beside him clutching their youngest, little Sarah, while their older children, Thomas, 12, and Eliza, 9, walked alongside to lighten the load. They had left the crowded farmlands of western Pennsylvania seeking the promise of cheaper, richer soil in the Ohio Valley. After months of travel plagued by rain, broken axles, and the constant fear of illness, they finally reached a 160-acre parcel Elias had claimed through a government land office. The tract was thick with dense hardwood forest and tangled underbrush, the soil dark and fertile but untouched by plow. The first days blurred into exhaustion. Elias felled trees with his broadaxe from dawn until the light failed, the rhythmic thunk of steel against wood echoing through the clearing. Martha and the children dragged branches aside, piling them for future fences or firewood. They slept under the wagon's canvas cover at first, waking to the chill of dew and the distant howl of wolves. Building shelter came next. Elias notched logs for a one-room cabin, chinking the gaps with mud and moss while Martha mixed clay for the dog. The children gathered stones for the hearth, their small hands blistered from the work. By midsummer, the cabin stood, crude, with a dirt floor and a single window of greased paper, but it was theirs. Clearing land demanded relentless effort. The family attacked the forest methodically, burning stumps after axes had done their work, the smoke rising in thick columns that could be seen for miles. Elias planted corn first, the staple crop that grew quickly and provided both food and fodder. He used a wooden plow pulled by the two remaining oxen, breaking the virgin soil in long, uneven furrows. Martha followed, dropping seeds by hand and covering them with her hoe. They sowed wheat in smaller patches, hoping for a surplus to sell at the distant mill town. Potatoes, beans, and squash filled the garden plot near the cabin, tended daily by Eliza and Sarah under their mother's watchful eye. Livestock was essential for survival. They brought a milk cow, a few chickens, and a sow heavy with piglets. The animals foraged on what grass they could find while the family built a rough rail pen. Milk meant butter and cheese for the table, eggs supplemented meals, and the pigs promised bacon and lard by winter. Hunting supplemented their diet, deer, rabbits, and wild turkey provided meat when crops were still green. Martha preserved what she could, salting pork, drying apples, and making cornmeal from the first ears. Isolation weighed heavily. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away through thick woods, and visits were rare. Letters from family back east took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Sickness struck without warning, fever, ague, or dysentery, and there was no doctor within reach. Martha brewed herbal remedies from knowledge passed down, willow bark for pain, yarrow for wounds. Faith sustained them. Evenings ended with Elias reading from the family Bible by firelight, the children listening wide-eyed as he spoke of providence and perseverance. Yet moments of quiet triumph emerged. The first corn ears roasted over the fire tasted sweeter than any store-bought grain. The cabin's walls held warmth against the cooling nights. The children learned to fell small trees, milk the cow, and read the sky for coming weather. Elias surveyed his growing fields with pride, knowing each felled tree and planted seed brought them closer to self-sufficiency. As autumn arrived, the family harvested what they could. Corn shocked in the field, pumpkins stored in the loft, and apples dried on strings. Winter loomed, promising hardship, but they had laid roots in the soil. The Harrisons were no longer wanderers, they were homesteaders, bound to this land by sweat, hope, and the unbreakable ties of family. In the vast American frontier, survival was not guaranteed, but for those who endured, it forged something enduring. By the second year on their Ohio homestead, the Harrisons had settled into a rhythm as steady and unforgiving as the turning of the seasons. Dawn broke with the rooster's crow, pulling Elias from the straw tick he shared with Martha. He rose first, built up the fire in the stone hearth, then stepped outside into the gray light to check the livestock. The cow needed milking before the day grew hot, the pigs required slop from last night's scraps, the oxen had to be yoked for whatever heavy work awaited. Every task carried weight, delay won, and the whole day unraveled. Martha moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency. She stirred cornmeal mush over the fire for breakfast, sliced yesterday's cornbread, and poured weak coffee brewed from roasted barley when real beans ran low. The children dressed quickly in homespun wool and linsey-woolsey, faces still soft with sleep. Breakfast was eaten standing or perched on benches, no lingering when daylight was the only clock they trusted. Elias and Thomas headed to the fields first. The corn needed cultivating, weeds choked the rows if left unchecked. Elias walked behind the single shovel plow, guiding the oxen with low commands and the occasional crack of the line. Thomas followed with a hoe, chopping at thistles and morning glory vines that threatened to strangle the young stalks. Sweat soaked their shirts by mid-morning. They paused only to drink from the wooden bucket Martha or Eliza brought from the spring, cool water that tasted of moss and iron. Back at the cabin, Martha and the girls worked the garden and the yard. Eliza hoed between rows of beans and cabbages while 9-year-old Sarah pulled weeds with fierce concentration. Martha gathered eggs, fed the chickens cracked corn, and churned butter in the wooden dash churn until her arms ached. She carried water in 2 oak buckets slung across her shoulders on a yoke, each trip to the spring a half-mile round journey. Laundry waited in a pile, boiled and limeade from wood ashes, scrubbed on the washboard, then spread on bushes to dry and bleach in the sun. Midday brought the only real break. The family gathered under the shade of a lone sugar maple near the cabin. Martha laid out cold cornbread, salt pork, pickled cucumbers from last fall, and buttermilk if the cow had been generous. They ate in near silence, listening to cicadas and the distant call of a hawk. Elias sometimes spoke of the next field to clear or the fence line that needed extending, but mostly they rested, letting the brief stillness recharge them. Afternoon stretched long and heavy. Elias split rails for fencing with maul and fro, the steady thump carrying across the clearing. Thomas hauled the finished rails to the edges of the fields, stacking them zigzag fashion into snake fences that required no posts and used every scrap of wood. Martha spun wool on the great wheel in the cabin when rain kept them indoors, the whir of the wheel a constant background. She carded fleece, twisted it into thread, then wove it into cloth on the small loom Elias had built from hickory saplings. The children learned these skills young. Sarah already could wind bobbins, and Eliza could mend torn trousers with tight, even stitches. Evening chores began as the sun dipped low. Cows were milked again, pigs fed kitchen scraps, chickens shut in against foxes. Elias checked the smokehouse where hams cured slowly over hickory chips. Martha cooked supper, usually corn pone baked in the Dutch oven, beans simmered with a chunk of fatback, and whatever greens grew wild or in the garden. After supper, the family gathered by the fire. Elias sharpened tools with a whetstone, Martha mended clothes by candlelight, the children practiced their letters on a slate or listened to stories of the old country. No one escaped the labor. Even Sarah, at 6, carried kindling, fed the chickens, and helped shell peas. Thomas, strong for 12, swung an axe almost as well as his father. Injuries were common, blisters turned to calluses, a slipped axe could gash a leg, a kick from an ox could break ribs, but rest was a luxury they could seldom afford. When fever took hold or a child fell ill, Martha nursed them while the others carried double loads. The work never stopped, it only shifted. Yet in that ceaseless labor lay a strange satisfaction. Each rail set in place, each row hoed clean, each jar of preserves sealed on the shelf represented progress measured in sweat. The fields expanded year by year, the cabin gained a lean-to for storage, the livestock multiplied. The Harrisons owned no clock, no calendar beyond the phases of the moon and the feel of the air, but they lived by a deeper time, the pulse of dawn to dusk, planting to harvest, hunger to fullness. As night fell, Elias barred the door against the dark. The family knelt together, heads bowed, as he thanked God for another day survived. Then they climbed into their shared beds, straw ticks layered with quilts Martha had pieced from scraps, and slept the deep sleep of the bone-tired. Tomorrow would call again at first light, relentless and certain. But for now, in the flicker of the dying fire, they rested, knowing the land demanded everything and, in return, gave them a place to stand. The third winter on the homestead arrived early and mean. Snow fell in late October 1825, blanketing the fields before the last corn could be shocked. Elias woke one morning to find the cabin door drifted shut, the wind howling through every crack despite fresh chinking. Inside, the fire burned low; outside, the temperature hovered near zero. The cow lowed miserably in her lean-to, milk frozen in the pail before Martha could finish churning. The family rationed firewood carefully, greenwood smoked and popped, but dry hickory was running thin after 2 hard seasons of clearing. Winter tested them hardest. Days shortened, light faded by 4 o'clock, and chores shrank to bare survival, feeding the animals twice daily, hauling water that froze in the buckets, keeping the hearth alive. Elias cut paths through the drifts to the barn, his breath freezing on his beard. The children stayed close to the fire, shelling dried beans and corn, their fingers stiff with cold. Martha boiled snow for water when the spring iced over, then stretched thin stews with whatever root vegetables remained in the root cellar, turnips, carrots, a few shriveled potatoes buried in sand. Food dwindled faster than planned. The sow had farrowed only 5 piglets instead of 10, 2 died in the first freeze. The smokehouse held less pork than hoped, and the deer Elias tracked through deep snow proved scarce. Hunger became a quiet companion. Breakfast might be nothing more than parched corn and weak sassafras tea; supper, a thin soup of beans and a scrap of fatback shared among 6. The children grew quieter, their cheeks thinner, but no one complained. Complaining wasted breath. Spring brought no gentle relief, only mud and more struggle. March rains turned the fields into a bog, the plow stuck fast, oxen sinking to their knees. When the ground finally dried in April, a late frost killed the first peach blossoms on the young trees Elias had planted. The apple saplings he'd carried from Pennsylvania leafed out weakly, their buds blackened overnight. Hope rested on the corn, always the corn, but planting delayed meant a shorter growing season. Summer turned cruel in its own way. June scorched the earth, no rain fell for 5 weeks. Corn leaves curled like parchment, tassels withered before they could silk. Elias walked the rows at dusk, praying for clouds that never came. The garden wilted, beans dropped their blossoms, squash vines drooped. The cow gave less milk, her ribs showing beneath patchy hide. Martha hauled every drop of water she could carry to keep the kitchen garden alive, but the well dropped low, tasting of iron and silt. Then came the pests. Chinch bugs swarmed the corn in July, sucking sap from the stalks until whole patches turned brown and brittle. Grasshoppers arrived in clouds, stripping leaves in hours. Elias tried every remedy he knew: smoke pots, hand-picking, planting trap rows of millet, but nature took its share. One field yielded barely half what the previous year produced, the other fared worse. Wheat, planted hopefully on the new-cleared ground, lodged flat under heavy rain that finally broke the drought in August, too late to save much. Illness followed hardship like a shadow. In late summer, ague struck, chills, fever, sweats that left a person shaking under blankets in 90-degree heat. Thomas caught it first, then Sarah. They lay on the tick for days, delirious, while Martha brewed quinine from dogwood bark and sponged their foreheads with cool cloths. Elias worked alone, splitting his time between field and cabin, fear gnawing at him. When fever broke, weakness lingered for weeks. No doctor lived closer than 20 miles, and even then, if payment was in produce they could ill afford to spare. Through it all, they adapted. Elias learned to read the sky better. High, thin clouds meant drought, low, dark ones promised rain but often brought hail instead. Martha experimented with wild foods, dandelion greens in spring, lamb's quarters in summer, persimmons in fall. She traded a bushel of dried apples with a neighbor for salt when their supply ran out. The family tightened belts, shared blankets, mended every tear, reused every scrap. Yet scarcity forged ingenuity. When the plow iron cracked, Elias fashioned a temporary wooden share from seasoned oak. When the cow went dry, they slaughtered an old hen and stretched the broth for days. When blight hit the potatoes, they dug what tubers remained early and replanted the eyes in fresh ground. Each small victory counted. By late autumn, the family gathered what harvest remained, sparse corn, a few pumpkins, withered beans, and stored it carefully. The root cellar held less than the year before, but enough to see them through if they were careful. Elias looked over the stubbled fields, the rail fences sagging under snow load, the cabin weathered gray, and felt the weight of another year survived. The seasons of scarcity did not break them. They bent, sometimes nearly to snapping, but the roots they had put down in that first hopeful spring held fast. Nature was indifferent, ruthless, beautiful in its indifference, but the Harrisons answered with stubborn, quiet endurance. Winter would come again, and spring after it, each cycle carving deeper lines in their hands and faces. Yet in the lean years they learned what abundance could never teach, that survival itself was a kind of wealth, measured not in bushels but in the simple fact that, come morning, they still rose to meet the day. By 1827, the Harrisons had lived through 4 full cycles of the seasons, and the land had begun to feel less like a stranger and more like kin. The cabin now boasted a second room, a lean-to addition Elias built with help from neighbors, and the field stretched wider, the rail fences straighter. Yet no amount of cleared acres or stored grain could shield them from the sudden blows life delivered. When hardship struck, it was family and the fragile web of neighbors that kept them standing. The first real test came in early spring when Elias suffered a deep gash across his forearm while splitting rails. The axe slipped on wet wood, slicing tendon and muscle, blood soaked his sleeve before he could wrap it. He walked the 3 miles home gripping the wound, face pale. Martha cleaned it with boiled water and yarrow, then bound it tight with strips of linen torn from an old sheet. For weeks Elias could not swing an axe or guide the plow. Thomas, just 13, took over the heavy work, yoking the oxen, cultivating corn, hauling wood, his young shoulders rounding under the strain. Martha and the girls kept the garden and livestock going, but every task felt doubled. It was the neighbors who tipped the balance. The McAllisters, a mile and a half east, sent their oldest boy with a wheelbarrow of firewood the day after the accident. Widow Grayson, living alone but tough as hickory, brought a jar of salve made from comfrey and beeswax, along with a loaf of rye bread she could ill afford to spare. When planting time arrived and Elias still could not grip a tool, 3 men from nearby homesteads appeared at dawn, the McAllister brothers and young Caleb Reed. They worked Elias's fields for 2 full days, plowing, planting, fencing, without asking for pay beyond a shared dinner of cornbread and buttermilk under the maple tree. "We all need help sometime," McAllister said simply, wiping sweat from his brow. "Next year it might be my barn that burns or my cow that dies." Community events stitched the scattered families together. Barn raisings were the grandest. When the Reeds lost their barn to lightning in July, word spread by riders and shouted greetings across fields. On the chosen Saturday, men arrived from 10 miles around with axes, mauls, and augers. Women brought pies, fried chicken, potato salad made from new potatoes, and jugs of cider. Children ran wild while the men raised walls in a single day, laughing and shouting encouragement. By dusk the frame stood tall, the next week families returned to nail siding and shingle the roof. The Harrisons gave what they could, Elias's strong back once healed, Martha's apple butter, the children's help carrying water, and received in turn the promise of aid when their turn came. Sickness bound them closer still. When Sarah fell ill with a rattling cough that winter, Martha feared consumption. She kept the girl by the fire, dosing her with onion honey syrup and keeping the cabin warm. Neighbors checked in quietly, a tin of broth left on the doorstep, a bundle of dried herbs, a whispered prayer. Widow Grayson sat with Sarah one afternoon so Martha could rest, telling stories of her own children long grown and gone. The girl recovered slowly, her strength returning with the spring thaw, but the memory of that shared vigil lingered. Barter kept the household afloat when cash was scarce. Money rarely changed hands, instead they traded what each had in surplus. Martha exchanged a wheel of cheese and a peck of dried beans for a bushel of wheat from the miller's wife. Elias traded a young gilt pig for iron nails and a new plowshare from the blacksmith. When the cow calved twins and they could keep only one, the extra went to the McAllisters in return for wool yarn Martha needed for winter socks. These exchanges were more than commerce, they were trust made visible, a promise kept without paper or coin. Within the cabin, kinship ran deepest. Elias and Martha rarely spoke of love in flowery terms, but it showed in small ways, the way he carved a wooden doll for Sarah after a hard day, the way Martha saved the last slice of cornbread for him when rations grew thin. The children learned early that family meant carrying one another's load. Thomas taught Eliza to read from the family Bible when evenings were long, Eliza showed Sarah how to card wool without tangling it. Arguments flared, over chores unfinished, words spoken sharp, but they mended quickly, driven by necessity and the knowledge that division meant ruin. Faith wove through it all. Sunday meetings happened whenever a circuit preacher rode through or when families gathered in someone's cabin. Voices rose in hymns sung without instruments, prayers offered for rain, for healing, for strength. The Bible rested on the mantel, its pages worn from use. Elias read aloud most evenings, the lamplight flickering over verses of endurance and hope. Those words steadied them when despair crept close. The bonds forged in hardship were not sentimental, they were practical, hard-won, and unbreakable. A neighbor's hand on the plow, a jar of salve, a shared hymn, these were the threads that held frontier life together. The Harrisons had come to the land alone, but they no longer stood solitary. In giving help and receiving it, they built something stronger than any single cabin or field, a community rooted as deeply as the crops they tended. As another winter approached, Elias looked out from the doorway at the smoke rising from distant chimneys and felt the quiet certainty that, whatever came next, they would face it together, not just as a family, but as part of something larger. The frontier demanded everything, but it gave back in the only currency that mattered, people who cared enough to show up when the need was greatest. By the autumn of 1840, 17 years had passed since Elias Harrison first drove his wagon onto that 160-acre claim in the Ohio Valley. The land had changed as much as the man who worked it. Where dense forest once stood, rolling fields of corn and wheat now stretched under the sun, bordered by sturdy rail fences that had been mended and extended season after season. The original one-room cabin had grown into a proper two-story frame house, whitewashed clapboard, glass windows shipped from Cincinnati, a wide porch where Martha could sit in the evenings and watch the children play. A large barn rose behind it, its hayloft full, its stalls occupied by a matched team of bays, a dozen milk cows, and a small herd of hogs fattened for market. The family itself had grown and shifted. Thomas, now 30, had married a neighbor's daughter, Rebecca, and built a cabin of his own a half-mile down the road. They already had 2 boys and expected a 3rd child by spring. Eliza, 26, had wed Caleb Reed and moved to a farm nearby, though she visited often with her little girl. Sarah, the youngest, was 19, tall, strong, and quick with numbers. She kept the household accounts in a ledger Elias had given her, tracking every bushel sold and every dollar saved. Elias and Martha, both in their late 50s, moved more slowly now, but their hands still knew the work. Gray streaked their hair, lines etched their faces like the furrows they once plowed. Progress arrived gradually, carried on the wind of change sweeping the frontier. The first dirt road had been widened and graveled, wagons rolled more easily to the growing town 10 miles away. A canal reached the county seat in 1835, linking them to distant markets. Suddenly corn and wheat fetched better prices, and store-bought goods, calico, coffee, iron tools, became less rare. The railroad came closer still. By 1839, tracks were laid 30 miles east, and word spread that trains would soon haul freight faster than any ox team. Elias had watched surveyors stake the line through neighboring land, marveling at the speed of iron and steam. Tools improved too. Elias traded for a cast-iron plow with a steel share that cut deeper and turned cleaner furrows than the old wooden one. A mechanical reaper, demonstrated at the county fair, cut wheat in hours what once took days by scythe. He could not yet afford one, but he saved toward it, knowing it would ease the harvest burden on aging shoulders. The children learned new ways. Thomas experimented with crop rotation and gypsum to sweeten the soil. Sarah read agricultural pamphlets that arrived with the mail, sharing ideas about seed selection and manure spreading. Wealth accumulated quietly. The family no longer lived hand to mouth. Surplus corn went to market, hogs to the packer, butter and eggs to the storekeeper. They bought a cookstove for the kitchen, Martha's delight, and a new spinning wheel that turned faster. A small flock of merino sheep provided finer wool. Martha wove blankets and traded the rest. The root cellar stayed full year-round, and the smokehouse held enough meat to see them through lean winters without fear. Yet prosperity did not erase memory. Elias still rose before dawn, still checked the livestock first thing, still read from the worn Bible by lamplight. Martha's hands, gnarled from decades of labor, kneaded dough with the same sure rhythm. They remembered the winters of empty plates, the summers of withered crops, the nights when fever burned through the cabin. Those years had taught them gratitude for every full ear of corn, every healthy calf, every sunrise that found them all still breathing. The land itself bore witness to their endurance. Young apple orchards bloomed each spring, their fruit now sold at market instead of dried for winter. A small peach grove Elias planted in 1830 bore heavily. The family canned the surplus and bartered jars for sugar and spices. The soil, once virgin and reluctant, had been worked and manured until it yielded reliably. Elias walked the field sometimes at dusk, running calloused fingers through the dark earth, feeling the weight of time in every clod. Legacy took shape in quieter ways. Thomas spoke of buying more acres when the railroad brought better prices. Sarah dreamed of teaching school in the new district once her own children came. The grandchildren, for now, ran through the yard, chasing chickens and climbing the maple that had shaded their parents' midday meals. Elias carved toys for them from scraps of wood. Martha sewed tiny quilts from leftover scraps. Stories passed down: the first winter under the wagon, the year the ague took hold, the day neighbors raised the barn frame in a single sunlit afternoon. As another harvest ended, Elias and Martha sat on the porch watching wagons haul the last shocks of corn to the barn. The air smelled of dry leaves and wood smoke. In the distance, a locomotive whistle sounded, faint but clear, a sound that would have seemed impossible when they first arrived. Elias reached for Martha's hand. She squeezed back without words. They had not set out to build an empire. They had come seeking a home, a place to stand against the world. What they found was harder and sweeter than they imagined, not just survival, but a life rooted deep, branches spreading to shelter others. The frontier had demanded everything: youth, strength, hope, and in return had given them this: fields that fed families, a house warmed by laughter, children who carried their stubborn spirit forward. The sun dipped low, painting the stubble gold. Elias looked at the land they had claimed and tamed, at the house they had built plank by plank, at the woman beside him who had shared every hardship and every small joy. He felt no need for grand speeches. The harvest was in, the legacy was growing. In the quiet of that Ohio evening, it was enough.